Welcome to the Always Better Than Yesterday podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Hartley. This podcast exists to equip and inspire your heart-centered leadership. Every week, we bring interviews with some of the greatest heart sets and mindsets on the planet. I hope the heartprint of our time spent together is that it creates new possibilities for you and all those you come into contact with. If you'd like to explore what we could make possible for you, then head to abty.co.uk/connect and book in a free 30-minute call to begin our journey together. I just want to express a huge amount of gratitude to our sponsors, Exhale Coffee. I have been a big fan of Exhale Coffee since meeting Alex and the team back in 2022. Exhale is the first coffee to be sourced, roasted and lab tested specifically to maximize its antioxidant and anti-inflammatory potency. An independent lab test has shown that 1 cup of Exhale Coffee has the same antioxidant power as 1.8 kilos of blueberries or 55 oranges. I'm a huge fan, and Mrs. H loves the decaf, especially because she knows that Exhale use the mountain water decaffeination process, which uses only pure glacial water from the highest mountain in Mexico and no nasty chemicals. Simply head to exhalecoffee.com/ABTY for your special offer. And lastly, before I introduce this week's guest, please do subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. It would really help us leave a greater heartprint on this world. On episode 293, what a joy it is to welcome Tim Duggan to the podcast. Tim is an optimist who loves thinking about big ideas. He co-founded several digital media ventures, most notably Junkee Media, which is one of the leading independent publishers in Australia. Tim is the author of 3 books. The first, Cult Status, was awarded the Best Entrepreneurship and Small Business Book at the 2021 Australian Business Book Awards. His second book, on creativity, Killer Thinking, was named one of the best books of 2022 by Apple Books. In today's episode, we talk about Tim's new book, Work Backwards, and we explore how anyone can take advantage of a once-in-a-generation's opportunity to rethink how and why we work. It's a great conversation. It's episode 293 with Tim Duggan. Tim, welcome to Always Better Than Yesterday podcast. How are you, brother?
I'm very good, thank you. Lovely to be here.
For people that are listening, they recognise your accent, but you are in the UK. You're in the middle of a UK book tour. How is England treating you?
It is cold and fresh, and as a Australian who lives in Spain, who is currently touring the UK, I am loving walking outside and putting on my jacket and putting on my gloves and my beanie and walking through snow and sliding through ice. And I know I say that as a visitor who enjoys it for 2 weeks and doesn't need to deal with the aftermath of it.
Yes.
But for now, it is beautiful.
And all the friends and family that are in Australia, it's like, we'll just delete them off social media for a week or two.
Yeah.
Let's not have those reminders of the glorious sunshine I'm sure that they're experiencing.
They are.
Yeah, well, I'm looking forward to our conversation. I think there's some really big ideas that you have put out into the world. And I guess for me, let's just start at the beginning with your authorship. It's like you've done some wonderful things in the world, and then you have to make this decision. Like, what's the first? I love books, and for me, it's about, there's that overwhelming sense before you've got one out into the world, before you've got into the routine and the rhythm of writing. It's like, what is my first one? Like, what is the first one that I want to see my name on the front of a book? And I guess, how did you get to a point in your life where your first book became the first one that you birthed?
Yeah, and I've written 3 books now, and I thought that it would get easier every time. And something I've realized after writing 3 of them and now starting to stare down the empty pages of my 4th is that it doesn't get any easier. So the process of doing it is just as messy, just as complicated, just as satisfying as it was the first time. So the first time I started thinking about writing a book, I had been building a business in Australia. So some friends and I co-founded a media company in Australia. And over 15 years, we built that up into about 60 or 70 full-time staff,
Mm.
a big beast of a small business.
Hmm.
And it was an amazing journey. It was a hard journey. It was one of the best things and one of the hardest things I think that I've
Mm.
done in my life. And part of doing that, we sold the company and I had an earn out with another company. And once I was in that earn out period where I was able to hand over some of the things that I didn't love doing, legal, finance, HR,
Yeah, yeah.
hand them over to a company of almost 1,000 people that had acquired us, that had big teams to deal with
Lovely.
this. All of a sudden, I had a little bit of headspace. So maybe 10 to 15% of my headspace got freed up.
Mm.
And the way that I view the world is I'm an optimist. I'm a very proud optimist. And I look around for pain points or interesting questions or topics that I think need a bit more discussion and talking about. And one of those questions at the time was why some businesses seem to really succeed and go well, and other businesses seem to flop and fail. What
Mm.
was it about those businesses? So I spent a couple of years traveling the world, speaking to people, reaching out to people I admired to try to figure out what some of those businesses had that set them apart. And the spoiler alert of this is that the businesses that really succeeded had really strong communities at the core.
Yeah.
They did, and that became my first book, Cult Status.
I love that. I'll need to check out that book in its entirety because that's powerful. That's something that's really important to me here at Always Better Than Yesterday is community. And I love like unpicking the words, the meaning behind words. And community for means com is like to be with and unity is to be one, right? So I love this
Mm.
idea that community is about coming together as one. And there are so many components that I'm sure that you've picked through around what does that really mean in practice? How do we create opportunities to come together as one? And there's one of the things that I think you talk about in that book, which is about a key leadership trait. Like leadership of any business or organization or culture is key, right? It sets the tone. Is what did you find around, particularly around the leadership of these cult status businesses that people love and adore? Like, what is it about the leader specifically?
Yeah, it was a really fascinating process because I spent a few years trying to one interview all these companies, and including some of my own journey of building the communities that I had built, and then tried to figure out what they have in common, and then trying to figure out how I can turn that into steps that anyone reading the book can follow. And one of the things I realized amongst great leaders was that they do a thing that I like to call lead from the middle, which is instead of leading from the front, which is a way that we sometimes think about business and leadership, that we are
Mm-hmm.
captain at the top and we're going to just, make people go where we want to go. The opposite to that is leading from behind, which
Mm-hmm.
is where I think Nelson Mandela used an analogy of like he felt like he was like a shepherd, and
Mm-hmm.
he was like behind a flock of people as they went where they went. And instead, this concept of leading from the middle was that
Yeah.
leaders that were at the center of really strong communities, they
Yes.
told everyone where they wanted to go. They told
Yes.
them why they wanted to go there, and then they let the community go there with them. So they almost walked alongside them.
Mm.
And that was scary at times. That was freeing at times. Sometimes your way of getting there is not the way the leader wants to go. You need to kind of go with the flow a little bit. But this concept of leading from the middle is really important for building a really strong community around your business.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. Particularly the word cult. I think it's getting quite a, you just got to look on Netflix. There's a number of documentaries around cult-like communities. And I don't think you're talking about it in that. I think you're talking about it much from a heart-centered perspective where, there's a win-win nature to these spaces and places where it's not exploitation and manipulation for the leader's gain, but it's one of being among, being with. One of the things I've always tried to lead my community with is a sense of I'm not the expert. Like, yes, I'll take the decision and the courage to have to do the things that take us and get us places, but under no illusion that there's this. It's like we do this with, and there's shared wisdom among the group, and but that requires a bit of humility and vulnerability what do you mean you don't know all the answers? Like, I come from a policing background. Like, my background was policing. I did 13 years. People's careers were built on how much they knew and how much expertise and time in and they'd had. So it's a completely different paradigm shift that we're talking about.
It really is. And one of the other steps in these 7 steps to building a business with cult status was about dropping the bullshit. And part of that was the authenticity around, I don't believe in the idea of faking it till you make it.
Yeah.
I think that's a bit bullshit because you are
Yeah.
faking it to somebody.
Yeah.
Instead, if you don't know something, like you just said then, admit it. Say, this is the
Mm.
first time I'm doing this, so let's fumble through this together.
Yeah.
And I think that's a way better way of building rapport, building authenticity.
Mm.
And by doing that, you're starting to show what your true values are, what you really care about. And the whole aim with building a strong community is finding other people who also have those
Mm.
same values that you can connect on a deeper level. And you're not
Mm.
going to get there if you're faking it or if you're lying or if you are pretending to be something that you're not.
Yeah. True. Um, that book took off. Why do you think it really landed well, really resonated?
Yeah, it's really fascinating. So I published that book was my first book, which published in 2020,
Sounds
and
interesting,
it
yeah.
a very interesting year. In fact, I wrote the entire book pre-COVID,
Yeah.
and it came out in July 2020, which it went to print in March or April 2020. So obviously that
Yeah.
was when COVID
Yeah.
properly hit for the first time. And as soon as this COVID thing happened and I heard about it, all of a sudden I was like, this book I have been writing for the last few years is going to be dead on arrival because these businesses are going to
Mm.
go out of business because
Mm.
no one knew what was going to happen to the world. Luckily
Yeah.
enough, I was able to have about a month to slightly update the book to talk about
Yeah.
what happened during COVID.
Yeah.
And two, this miraculous thing happened, which was that all these businesses that I chose, and there was 50 or 60 of them before COVID, chose them because they had this strong community. What happened during hard times was their community rallied around them.
Yeah. Come on.
And they actually became stronger because of their community.
Yes.
So it was a really fascinating, a flip for me. And the most interesting thing about Cult Status is it's been out now for 4 or 5 years, and it ended up selling more copies in its third or fourth year than it did in its first year.
Yeah.
So it's kind of building this really interesting momentum behind it. And it's because community is such a important topic for so many people.
Mm.
And I think it's because we're starting to realize as time goes on how important that is. One
Mm.
of the things I love to do in my book also is do practical steps at the end of each chapter. So you get a chapter, great, give me all the examples, tell me the theory, show me why I should be doing something. And then what I love doing is, okay, now actually, what are the steps that I can do? I've got a piece of paper in front of me, I've got a pen, what should I do? And
Yeah.
so I can watch each month the number of downloads of these worksheets and I could just
Nice.
consistent kind of coming through of people putting it into practice. And I just adore that.
Well, hats off to people doing the work. I think we're a generation. I often think about my parents' generation, and I speak with some friends, and didn't have this kind of stuff available to them. It wasn't, social media gurus, and there wasn't this. And I think we've got a real generation that are committed to, self-improvement. Listening to podcasts like this, for example. And all right, let's chapter this part of the podcast. What are one or two things that people can do then, really, if they're business owners starting a business? What are one or two of the things that they can do to really start the foundations of a company like you talk about that is just loved and adored?
So I think the very first thing is probably the most important thing that you can do, which is before you do anything else. So before you think about how many widgets you want to sell, before
Yeah.
you think about what you should call something, and this is if it's a new project, you can also do
Yeah.
this if it's something that already exists. You should really write down on paper what is the impact that you want to have if you are successful. A
Mm.
really simple way that I like to think about this is with the introduction of something called an impact statement, which
Yes.
is that most companies have a mission statement. Um, we should add an addendum to the
Mm.
end of a mission statement that says what is the impact that's going to happen if we're successful in our mission. And
Yes.
that is something I think that every business owner should think about and should be adapting and adding an impact statement to your strategy plan.
Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it? Because we're going to have that impact whether we're conscious of it or not. People are going to benefit or they're going to suffer based on how we show up, how we lead, the service that we provide, how we market the thing. Like, it's going to happen. And I think to make that process conscious, and even doing the flip side, sometimes it's useful to have the guardrails, is to know what are some of the things I want to make conscious that I don't want to have people feel or experience or have as well. And I think that creates such a opportunity for deliver just being intentional within the world, being intentional.
100%. And I think you nailed it when you said that all of us have impact. So
Yeah,
whether in our daily lives, in our personal lives, in our business lives. So either we take hold and really try and direct what that impact is and make sure it's fulfilling for both us and our customers and our clients and our suppliers, or it's just going to happen anyway accidentally. So
yeah.
I think just being conscious about it, it's a great point.
Yeah, because like if you're doing good stuff and you're having a good impact, then wouldn't it be good to know the formula that got you like
Yeah.
to do more of that, to scale it? And
Would love to
likewise, if
think.
if you're harming people, it's useful to kind of be aware of that. And I guess it's kind of like a self-awareness activity, but on a business scale.
I think almost everything, the one common thread going through all three of my books is self-awareness. I
Mm.
actually think that the worst way to live life is an unexamined life,
Ooh.
where you are not aware of what you are doing, why you are doing it, how you are doing it, because
Mm.
that is one way to sleepwalk through life and through business. So I think that self-intentionality, that self-awareness, that consciousness around what am I doing? What's the impact I want to have? All of that is probably the most important. That's the overarching message from all three of my books.
Yeah, there's a this is the second or third conversation I've had on this, but there's an article going around at the moment, I think in the US, that researchers found that only 1 in 5 at work are thriving. 4 in 5 people are not thriving, and they're labeling it the zombie apocalypse, the working dead, sleepwalking, and I think that's kind of what your latest book is all about answering. So I'm gonna tease it there because I don't want to miss out the middle book. I don't want to miss out the middle child. you know. So how did we go from end of that period then with the first book into, oh God, I'm gonna do this again. Like I'm gonna do this again. Like tell us about that
Yeah,
period.
it was maybe I'm a sucker for punishment.
Character
Um,
building.
I think because the first book, Cult Status, did so well and it started reaching so many people and it really connected me to my personal impact, which is
Mm,
how much I love one, building communities
yeah,
myself. And
yeah,
when you write a book, you're building a community of people that also think that same way.
yeah.
And it made me look around my life and look around my experience and my areas of interest and try to think of other thorny questions that I think hadn't been answered.
Mm, mm,
And this was now, we're living in a post-COVID world. So COVID was here, and all of a sudden people were working from home and some people were in an office. And one thing that really struck me was how much some of the ways that we think about creativity, the ways that we think
mm.
about collaboration, were all designed in a 1940s, 1950s mindset and hadn't been updated for the modern world.
Yeah.
So the next big question I tackled was about creativity, particularly creativity in the workplace, and
Yes.
how anyone can take this ethereal process that exists up here around creativity. We think only some people are creative. How we can, one, turn that into a process, and
Yes.
two, how can we take a germ of an idea and massage it and make it better and finesse it and refine it until it becomes a truly brilliant idea. And that became my second book called Killer Thinking.
Yeah, I love that. My role at the police was organizational development analyst type stuff, which was, I had to be a creative problem solver. But if you would have asked me 10 years ago, am I creative? I'd have been like, absolutely not. I am rubbish with my hands.
Yeah.
Like, I'm not artistic. I'm not musical. I'm not therefore I concluded I'm not creative. And then I kind of built this community and this podcast. I'm like, ha, I am creative. I just create environments. I create
Mm.
experiences. I create solutions. And that was such a freeing kind of perspective for me that just, it's not, am I or am I not creative? It's just like, how am I creative? How do I create? And that just shifted everything for me.
Yeah, how wonderful. I now do workshops all around the world teaching organizations of all sizes how to be more creative.
Yeah.
And the way that at the start of the workshop, I ask people, and let's say there's 50 people in a room, I'm like, who here would kind of consider themselves creative?
Yeah.
And not many people put their hand up. By the end of it, the accountants, the lawyers, the finance team, the
Yeah.
receptionists, everyone is realizing that creativity is about approaching problems in different
Mm,
ways.
mm.
It is about using your brain to, as you said, create environments, create communities. I actually think lawyers are some of the most creative people in an organization because they need to find a way through using the
Yeah.
confines of the law, hopefully.
Yes. Yes.
Accountants are super creative because there's rules around accountancy and they need to find creative ways through it. So I really challenge that idea of who is
Mm.
creative. One of the things I also loved about this book was the way that I write a book is I think of a big topic, a big question that I have, and then I spend a few years researching, writing, traveling the world, speaking to people, reading research papers. And what I came up with for killer thinking was that killer is actually an acronym in this case, which actually stands for what the best ideas in the world all have in common.
Mm-hmm.
And it stands for that all the great ideas in the world are kind, impactful, loved, lasting, easy, and repeatable. And
Mm.
all of a sudden, that's a framework there that exists around if you have an idea for a podcast, for something you want to bring into the world, you can put it through this framework of kind, impactful, loved, lasting, easy, repeatable, and figure out how can I make it more kind? How can I make it more impactful or loved or lasting or easy or repeatable? And that to me is really wonderful because anytime I come up with an idea now, I put it through this framework and try and figure
Mm.
how do I simplify this to make it easier? How do I make
Yeah.
this really repeatable as a process?
Really soulful. Is there's
Yeah,
I love the work of Elizabeth Gilbert. Was whether people believe this or not, it's this idea that ideas are spiritual. That
yeah,
creativity is a spiritual act. You're taking something and you're manifesting something that into reality. Yeah, that's powerful. I am with creativity. I notice that I struggle if life is busy. If it's like right, we've got like I remember in the police, right? We've got an hour to be innovative. We've got an hour to be creative. Do you know what I mean? Like everyone, it's like right, everyone shut your laptops. We've got an hour.
yeah.
Clock's going. Man, when I'm under pressure like that, creativity is like, what are some of the conditions that we can create within ourselves or as leaders within our teams to really nurture and facilitate a creative environment?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and I think sometimes there is pressure to come up with an idea in a certain period of time. And the way that I approach this is that most organizations tend to think of the brainstorms are the best way to do it.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
I loathe brainstorms because I think most of them are implemented in the wrong way. They're normally done terribly. I have sat through hundreds, potentially thousands of them myself when I ran my business, and we had an agency as part of that.
Yep.
I facilitated hundreds of dud ones. So I'm putting my hand up here to take some of the blame. Instead, the process that I like to think of is how can we think of things individually before sharing things with a group.
Yep.
And I have a really simple model, which I call a cerebration model. And so cerebration is originally from Isaac Asimov, the science fiction writer, who came up. I was reading some of his letters on creativity, and he
Mm,
used the term cerebration, and I love it because for me, it's like cerebral and a celebration coming together.
love it.
And I have a really simple three-step process, which is kind of based on a birthday party theme. And what you would do, and the first part is you blow up balloons, which is about interrogating the problem. Particularly, you do that individually before you do that as a group, which I think is really important. The second part is then you write out the cards. So you go to a
Yeah.
birthday party, you write out cards, which is about doing things individually. And then the third part is about sharing the presents, which is where you then start sharing it and add it on to each other. And that really simple three-step process built around a birthday party is
Mm.
a way that I help other companies and other people get into that creative mode, even when they don't feel like doing it, because there's a real process around it. And you can do it in 60 minutes, 90 minutes, and come up with amazing ideas.
There's a dark side to being creative, which is the perfectionism type. I will not share this until I think it's perfect. And I think so much of what I've learned over the years is that get it out and then that iterative process can then start. that refinement that we can, I think Adam Grant talked about it in Give and Take, where a lot of the process of writing the script of The Simpsons, for example, improved because there was this to and fro within the team. And,
Mm.
I think so much of us have that kind of like, oh, I don't want to share it yet. It's not quite ready. And we potentially miss the great, perspective. Like I'm maybe not a great person to come up with ideas, but I might be able to see the connection with something, and it just makes space for that community kind of, particularly if you run an agency for people to chip in and really make it, take it and run with it.
The creative process is the rewriting. It's the
Yeah,
editing. It's
yeah.
Ed Sheeran talks about it. He calls it the dirty tap theory, which
Mm,
is that when he writes songs, and he's one of, whether you love him or not, he's an amazing songwriter. And
yeah.
he calls it the dirty tap because he says when he first starts writing water, it's like the tap in the water in the tap is dirty and it comes out and it's brown and it's mucky. And he just needs to keep the tap on and keep it running
Mm,
in order to get to the good stuff. And
yes.
if I showed you any of my first drafts of any of my books, they were a dog's breakfast. I didn't think at the time. I thought, wow, this is okay. I'll hand it into my agent or my publisher. And they were basically looking back now, they're
Yeah.
all over the place. And we're so used as a society to seeing the end product. So we
Yeah.
hear the song on the radio, we see the musical in the theater, we read the book, and you read the book and everything makes sense. There's this really clear process. There's one, there's two, there's three. It makes sense. But in order to get sometimes to a simple three-step process, you might go through 21 iterations of it to get.
Yeah.
You've just got to
Yeah.
start with that very first one.
I love that. My wife's a musician, and I think she's going to listen to this section back a few times just to really give her the freedom. Because there's one thing I've always said about podcasting: if you're going to do a podcast, do 10, don't judge it, just get it out.
Mm.
Like you will iterate, you will learn, you will improve because you're a human being. Human beings, learn via doing and feedback, and yes, that's really powerful.
Yeah.
The
Another example of this is I originally was a writer in my early years. I started writing for Rolling Stone and a bunch of other publications when I was in my
Yes,
early 20s, then built a business and a company accidentally and started managing people and didn't really write for about 15 years.
Hmm.
What I've now done, I've now come back into writing and
Yes,
I write books and I write a weekly column for Australia's largest newspapers. And in that weekly column, it's all about work and careers. I
yes,
have now, by doing it every single week, by having a deadline, by having to put out things that are not perfect and cannot the ability to craft every single word, I've gotten really good at
Hmm.
writing columns about topics and figuring out how to hook someone in, how to
Yeah,
get
yeah, yeah.
information across, how to make it readable. And that's simply because I'm forcing myself to do the work and punch out a column every single week. And that's a
Yeah.
really interesting creative exercise for me.
It's really powerful because those reps that you did in your 20s, they can't be taken away from you. They don't just
Mm,
disappear. Yes, we might, like, if we don't go to the gym for a while, we get a little bit rusty and, not as quite tip-top performance but it soon comes back because it can't be taken away from you.
mm,
And I think that's really powerful. And anyone's listening is that, it's all whatever we're doing, whether you're on the path or not, it can't be taken away from you. It's like stacking up little blocks, and every little rep you get to stand on top of that. And
mm.
this is, I guess, what happens if you continue to do that, put enough reps in, you then get to withstand a great deal of pressure and it flow through you. I think if you look at all the research on flow, it requires both the ability to be present and in the moment, but with a high degree of challenge. It's just almost bringing you out of your comfort zone. And I think I say if someone said to you, right, you're on a podcast in an hour, there's no brief, you go in, like you've put in the reps, you know your work, and you're able to do that and deal with that performing under pressure so much calmly. But you do that kind of 15, 20 years ago, it's a different level of being able to perform under that level of pressure.
100%. I tell you what, my first few podcasts, I would hate to go back and listen to them. I would prepare for them. I would write out notes. I would be
Yeah.
nervous. I would be drinking water. I would be sweating. Um,
Yeah.
and then,
Like an interrogation.
yeah, totally. I don't think I would be a very good podcast guest. Whereas now I know the content so well. I
Yeah.
live it, I breathe it. I love
Yeah.
talking about it. Like it's really one of my passions that one of the most interesting things, the reason why I love having chats with people like you, Ryan, is because every conversation is different.
Mhm.
And it's about what you bring to it, what I bring to it, and we end up fixating on a certain issue or something else. And that's because it's of interest to you, it's going to be of interest to your listeners. And I love that because it means that
Yeah.
no two chats are the same.
We're creating.
We are. Yeah, yeah. We're creating totally. Another example of this is I'm currently on a book tour
Yeah.
in the UK for my third book, which I'll talk about in a second. And as part of this, I'm doing 6 dates around the UK. Last week I was in Birmingham and Manchester and Milton Keynes, and this week doing 3 dates in London. And it's about an hour, and it's me talking, and I have no notes. I just kind of talk about whatever I can feel. There's
Yeah.
obviously a script of what I want to talk about, but whatever I
Yeah.
can feel the audience wants to talk about. And then, depending on who is in the room, my favorite part is about half an hour, so about 50% of the time on a Q&A.
Yeah.
And that is because every organization is different. People bring the most interesting questions, and we go down these rabbit holes that makes every single date on my book tour completely unique. And
Mm.
that's interesting for me, hopefully interesting for the audience. I just
Yeah.
love those interactions and where they go.
Well, I think it's testament to your servant's heart because you want to meet people where they're at and give them the most amount of value for them. Like we can have our own agenda, but we can passionately share what we want to share. But I love the fact that that's important to you because I think that's where you meet people where they're at and walk alongside them. It's
Mm.
testament to everything you've written and you talk about. Before we move on to your latest book, I got one final question about killer thinking, um, which is interestingly, yesterday I spoke to one of the world's leading child development psychologists. His name's Dr. Gordon Neufeld, co-authored a book with Gabor Mate. And one of the things that he's talking about the process of this will make sense, I promise you. One of the things he's talking about the process of maturation is that children need to be able to feel sadness, feel anger, feel tears, and so much of life is like filled with busyness. We're not feeling. We're not actually embracing those uncomfortable feelings. We're not embracing suffering. And one of those feelings that we're not embracing is boredom.
Mm.
We're not we're not allowing ourselves or our children to experience boredom. There's always a screen that's placed. There's always a TV on demand or a Netflix. And yet they're missing a great gift that boredom can provide creativity. Why do you believe that boredom is the mother of creativity?
I adore boredom. And I think all of us should be way more bored than we are. And society is pushing us at every moment to listen to a podcast as we walk, to
Mm.
watch a movie as we're on the tube, to get on a plane and press play straight away and just not
Yeah.
just sit there and think and marinate in our thoughts. And I got interested in this topic when I was in my early 20s, and I wanted to see what would happen to my brain if I got really, really, really bored. And the way that I decided to do that was I went and found a deserted island that nobody lived on, and I got permission to camp on this deserted island by myself with no phone, no books, no music, just me and
Yeah.
my cat for a couple
Yeah.
of weeks. Yeah. And I detailed some of this in Cult Status, and I talk a little bit more about it in Killer Thinking because it's just been this inflection point in my life.
Yeah.
And I got into this island. I had this fantasy of what I thought it would be, like based on Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where you start off at the bottom of shelter and food, and you get to the top, which is self-actualization. So I was going to be thinking, I was going to be writing poetry, I was going to be, talking to the birds in my head.
Wilson.
Yeah, yeah. And I got there and I hated it. It
Yeah.
was really, really hard. It was lonely. I was genuinely bored. I spent my days counting the zips on my jacket. I
Wow.
spent my day just kind of wishing that I wasn't there. It was cold. I realized why some islands are uninhabited, which is that they are really loud and noisy, and the wind just kept on whipping this
Oh,
entire island around. So I never had any solace. That was for about a week and a bit, and I
wow.
just was hating every minute of it. And then one day I went and I was walking around the island to kind of discover some more parts of it. And I went to this part, which I called Reflection Point because it was All of a sudden, I walked around a corner and the wind stopped and it was protected. And there was all these like almost like rocks in the water. And I started walking on these rocks, kind of doing like a walking meditation. And all of a sudden, the entire thing flipped for me. And I just had this almost spiritual kind of aha moment of just like, oh my God, this is really beautiful. And I walked back to my campsite and where there was like spider webs that were, really scary to me before, all of a sudden
Mm.
they were like glistening in the sunlight and they were beautiful. And I realized how much your own headspace and your own perspective on things is the secret to figuring out how an experience is going to go. And for the rest of the trip, I then really held on to that. And I felt almost like a balloon. And sometimes I could feel it drifting away and I had to like consciously bring it back.
Mm.
And it made me realize then how important mindset is and headspace, how important it is to actively hold on to it. It's not something that can
Yes.
passively happen. And that's when I really discovered the beauty in boredom and started writing about it and thinking about it. But it took me a long, most people don't get through the hard part to get to the good part.
The detox. It's literal detox. We're
Mm.
overwhelmed. I love that story. That's so powerful. That's so powerful. You're right. It is a daily practice. It's not a one and done thing. And something happens with that kind of awakening, isn't it? We just see the beauty in things that were already there.
Hmm.
I've got two dogs, and I look at my dog and I think, I have these weird spiritual moments where I'm looking at my dog going, "Oh, you've got eyes. You've got a nose. Like you've got lungs. Like you're more like me than I realized."
Yeah.
I'm like, what am I doing? Having a spiritual moment with my dog. Anyway, let's move on to your final book. Your latest, your greatest. Work backwards.
Yes, so my third book is called Work Backwards, and it was published in Australia earlier last year. It published in Australia last year, and it was published in the UK and worldwide in November. And it is the question that I was thinking about with this book was all about work. And the reason why I was thinking about it was three things happened to me. One was that I left my job after 15 years, that I had co-founded this company and built this company kind of partly in my image. And my identity was very discombobulated after that. Didn't know who I was because
Mm,
I was so entwined with my job. Second thing that
mm,
happened was COVID, which happened to all of us. I was in Australia at the time, so we were stuck there for 2 years. So my husband and I, we jumped into a camper van because I'd finished up work and drove as far as we could for about 6 weeks, and then that 6 weeks turned into about a year on the road.
yeah.
Kept on driving and driving, and that for me was a way of shedding some of my former work.
Mm,
And the third thing that happened was my father passed away, who was the
mm,
biggest influence on my life and my greatest mentor. And all three of these things all kind of hit around the same time and led me to have some kind of existential crisis. Who
mm,
am I? What am I doing? What work am I doing? What's my legacy going to be? All those big things that we tend to not think about until you sit down to write the eulogy at your dad's funeral and you realize someday someone's going to be writing the eulogy at my funeral. And what do I want them to say? So all these things led me to really think about work and life. And so I spent a few years traveling the world, speaking to experts, speaking to dozens of people all around the world, and came to the conclusion that the way that we're working is broken. Uh,
mm,
and it's for some of those reasons that you mentioned. So things like disengagement. I've looked a lot into engagement and seen similar studies. There's a Gallup State of the Global Workplace study that says exactly as you said, about 75% of people, roughly three quarters of people, are either actively or passively disengaged with the work that
mm,
I found that overwork was a huge issue.
mm,
Stress, burnout, go in the wrong directions. I found apprehension was increasing, a lot to do with AI and technology and what's to happen to people's jobs. So almost every metric that I looked at for a couple of years was going in the wrong direction. And it led me to then, as an optimist, think, well, if the way that we're working is broken, how can we fix it?
mm,
Obviously we can't, solve too many of the structural problems, inequality and things like that. One book is not going to solve this, but what we do have some control over is how we think about our own approach to work. And that led me to a really simple philosophy, which I call work backwards, which is instead of thinking about life, work first, and then that gives you money, and then we're going to live our life based on what's left over. You need to flip it around and think of life first. So think of what are the parts of my job that I find meaningful. How do I get meaning outside
Mm.
work? Then think about what money do I need to live that life that gives me meaning that I find worthwhile and fulfilling for me. And then and only then, what are some of the tools that I can use now to tweak my job or to make sure I'm in the right job in order to live that kind of life I want to be living? And that's called work backwards.
It's I like the story that you talk about taking your godson around the zoo and the gift shop story because what is that story? What is the realization that we have?
Yeah, this realization is so there's three basic steps in the book. The first step is around creating a map, which stands for meaning, anchors, and priorities. The second part is around knowing what enough is for you, and the third part is knowing what the tools are that you can use. And my godson, he's this wonderful little human with a lot of energy, and we took him to the zoo one time. And my husband and I took him to the zoo, and we stupidly, naively, as a childless couple, decided to take him to the gift shop at the end. And we took him through the gift shop. And of course, the first thing he does is see the largest, most impractical toy that he can find and says, I want that one. And no matter what other toys we showed him after that, we couldn't get him away from thinking about that toy. And what it shows is that when you show somebody something, you
Mm,
can't take it back. And this
mm,
was just a real simple analogy to talk about a 4-year-old boy and what happens when you show him something and you can't take it back. In this case, for most of us who work, COVID years showed us another side of working,
yeah.
showed us what happens if we do reassess some of those priorities in our life, take back some of the power. And now we're living in this era in 2025 where there's this wild tug of war going on between employers and employees.
Mm, mm,
And everyone asks me in every single date of my book tour, what is going to happen with this? And I try and take a wider picture at the moment because every business is different, every boss and organization is different. But the wider picture is that we are at least having this conversation. And there is a tension point now that exists that did not exist 5 years ago.
yeah.
We're able to have this conversation around should we go into an office 5 days a week for the people who can? Where is the best place for me to do my work? What is the most productive way in order to get my job done? And also, what is most fulfilling and beneficial for me as a worker who ideally is in it for the long run? Work is a marathon, not a sprint. And I
Mm.
think part of the COVID years has kind of given us some lessons to help guide us in these areas.
Yeah, there's almost an ego arrogance to the world of business, particularly from maybe an older generation who have a completely different value set. The value set of the older generation was you do that, you work, you proceed, and I was kind of at the tail end of that where I was, the wife, house, cars, two children, next promotion. And fortunately, I had a realization that it was taking me away from who I wanted to be for those who truly mattered to me. So I,
Mm.
I was fortunate enough to have a hobby and a passion which I loved, which is coaching, to go, I've got a pathway out here rather than sleepwalking myself into more suffering and pain, not just for me, but for everybody else that interacts with me, right? That's the real impact, is the second ripple. If we talk about 75% sleepwalking, well, those 75% interact with however many people a day. That's a lot, right?
Yeah, and I think,
And good.
sorry, you go.
No, good.
I was just saying a lot of this comes back to that overarching theme that we spoke about earlier around consciousness.
Mm,
So most of us default to the path that our parents
yeah.
have done and their parents before them. And there's no shade towards this, as in everyone's life is their own. But when all these statistics are going in the wrong direction, something has to break. And I say that unless we change that, that something's going to be ourselves.
Yeah.
So there's if you are listening to this and there's a element of sameness or just default or I haven't thought about that or the career path that I chose when I was 20 and thought it was interesting, I'm now still in when I'm 40. it is never too late to question and to rethink that path that you are on. But you need to, people come to me all the time and they say, what work should I do? How can I make my work life better? And
Mm.
that is part of the problem is we're thinking work first.
Yeah.
You go back to the start, and I say the very simple thing is create a map, which stands for meaning, anchors, and priorities.
Hmm.
You need to do that work first before you can think about work. Because the problem is we tend to think work first as a default.
Yeah. Part of my framework here is I talk about heart work, which is that, looking first within is going, what are the gifts and the skills and the talents that I have, and how might I use those in the service of other people?
Mm,
And I think many people have an inkling as to what those things might be, but there's this mindset that says, well, I can't do that. I can't be. That's no, whether it's their own limitations, cultural limitations, a parent's voice that says, "Oh, there ain't no money in that," or "Are you kidding? You can't do that as a job." And and I think that there's an opportunity, isn't there, to invite people to go back to where are you most, you know, childlike, joyful, playful, creative. Like, where does your spirit come alive? And then you go, who needs that? If
yeah.
we're a mosaic of 8 billion people, you fit perfectly like a puzzle. There is something you have that the world needs.
Yeah. And I view this personally as when I was a kid, I would sit there and I would write radio plays. I think there were early versions of podcasts. I didn't realize them, but I would
Yeah,
force my brothers and sisters I'd press play on a record on the tape recorder and
yeah,
make them read out scripts that I wrote and then write all these things. And for me, this love of writing was something that
yeah,
I loved in my 20s, got distracted by business, and I was happy I did. It was a really joyous time. But now that I've gone back to that thing that fulfilled me, and I spend my days thinking about words, thinking about ideas. I'm currently chatting to my agent about what a fourth book should look like, and it is messy at this stage because here's an area and it takes a lot to get through and find the way through. And that to me, I feel like I'm in my element. I really
yeah,
feel like I'm kind of connecting with something that I just adore doing, and I can be inside my own head. I can write, and it's the way that I make sense of the world.
yeah. What if a midlife crisis was actually, in fact, getting back to the heart of who we always have been? Just stuff got put on top of it with the way of the world, kind of.
100%.
Yeah,
I think, and a lot of people don't listen to that midlife crisis,
yeah,
or they think the answer to that is buying a new car,
yeah,
or a new partner, or
yeah.
whatever it is, without actually looking inside and figuring out. So where is this crisis coming from? And generally, it comes from the fact that have moved away from that which you can best serve the world and serve
Yeah.
yourself. And as soon as you're able to reconnect with that, it's just wonderful.
Where is my outer world out of alignment with my inner world?
Mm,
And how
so
many
nice.
people change their internal compass based on what the world needs or expects of them? And they no wonder it's disorienting. But one of the things that maybe there's some business owners that are listening that goes, all right, okay, the needs of the workers are gonna they're gonna start to have their own kind of life priorities. Well, how do I get the best out of them? Like, how do I create an environment that gets the best out of them, knowing that they ain't gonna stick around forever, knowing that they've got some boundaries, better boundaries than maybe my previous generation of workers. What can I do as a business owner to create an environment that is conducive of your work backwards methodology?
I think sometimes there is a bit of cognitive reframing that needs to happen. And that is because generally the people in charge, the managers, have been in the workforce for longer than the people underneath them. And generally they therefore have very set perceptions of how things should be because that's how they were for them. So I don't hold anything against any older generations who are demanding that we go back to how things used to be because that's all they know.
Mm,
The one thing that I do ask is we are now living in an age of co-creation, of figuring out not only what an organization wants, but also what the people want, and trying to live within that healthy tension space that exists in
mm,
the middle. It's going to be messy.
mm.
There's no one size fits all, it is a conversation. We're very early in the days of figuring out what this means for us as society, for our businesses, for our workers.
Mm,
But having these conversations and being okay with them being a bit messy and with there being tension between employers and employees
mm,
is all that I ask. And I think that any leader who is listening to this should not be afraid of that messy middle and should not be afraid of the tension and of the gray area that exists between where what they think they want and what employees want and employers want.
mm.
That is where the magic is going to happen over the next couple of years.
Life work balance. And you know what? I've mused on LinkedIn's a funny place. I mused on LinkedIn a couple of years ago now, and it was just an observation, and it was there was I was seeing some people talking about the new generation, the lazy, they don't want to work hard, and I was like, I'm going to be a bit more compassionate. I'm going to look at it for a different lens. I think these people are coming into the workforce with different values because they've seen what the previous workforce did to their parents.
Hmm.
Workaholics, didn't look after themselves, ended up in divorce. They probably wanted their parents to stay together more than anything in the world. So they're not interested in going into the workplace. I know I'm oversimplifying, but we have to understand that people are going to come into the world with a different perspective of work. And if it's had negative consequences on their parents, based on the stats you've said, sleepwalking, not present, stressed, unhealthy. You know, children have received that generation of parents. It can't not affect their beliefs about what work is, what should be, what it could be.
1,000%. I'm really behind you on that one. And I think the easy thing to do is to view that through the eyes of what we think we know, and we think we know better, and that is lazy and entitled and
Yeah.
all those things that get thrown at every generation when they're young, but particularly at Gen Z now. So most kind of workers in their late teens into their late 20s. And in fact, I think they have the right attitude towards work, which is they understand it's a marathon, it's not a sprint.
Mm.
They want to do everything they can to avoid burning out and avoid these statistics going the wrong direction.
Yeah.
And they are prioritizing often, once again, this is generalization, but based on statistics and research, generally prioritizing and making sure that life outside work is just as important as life inside work. And the one message to leaders that I often say is if you want a happy worker in the office, you need to ensure they're a happy human outside the office. And the way that you do that is through good policies, lots of leave, switching off, making sure this is not about productivity. Of course, when they come into the office, if you want someone to focus, they're still got to be focused. It's not about being
Yeah.
lazy. But if you have a happy worker outside the office, they'll be a happy human also
Mm.
inside the office. And I think that's really, really important. I think that Gen Z in particular know that and trying to protect their life outside work.
Well, it's powerful, and it's funny how the overlaps to the conversation with Gordon Neufeld with the child developmental psychologist is like relevant because in his book he talks about bullying is when a child displays the level of courage or vulnerability that they have believed that they cannot experience.
Mm.
So if my daughter goes into school and she's wearing something that's kind of outrageous, right? And people say I wouldn't be seen dead wearing that. What they're actually saying is I am not able to be seen wearing that because I would socially die. And I think so much of Gen Z then represent a new way of being that the older generation probably wished they could be, have been told is not possible. So they attack that. If we're using the child development kind of framework, they attack that because you represent something that I've been told that I cannot be, and if I cannot be it, you cannot be it.
And that's the very similar mentality in a
Yeah,
workplace.
yeah,
So bosses who are demanding 5 days back in the office says more about the boss than it does around the workers.
yeah.
And I think that's going to be shown in the long arc of history. I think we will find that are the best workers going to be attracted to that company, or are
Mm,
they going to be attracted to more flexibility? And that's something I think in 10 years' time we'll look back and we'll see some of these decisions that have been made, I don't think have they say more about the person making the decision than about anything else.
You're right. Time will tell. Time will tell, and I think there's a sweet spot. I think there's a sweet spot where is a win-win relationship. There's always a win-win relationship. The employee thrives, the organization thrives, and yeah, time. And I like the fact that in your book you reference the fact that a lot of the old kind of glorifying psychology culture books are about the Nikes and the Apples of this world, but there are a lot of companies out there that have done, a lot of new, courageous, innovative, community-based things, and so the new Nikes and Apples, they're out there now. They just look and feel very different.
They do, and we should be celebrating them as much as we celebrate those big companies. Because great, let's learn from Nike and Apple and Red Bull and all these big companies that are now global behemoths. But I think the best new lessons are coming from upstart entrepreneurs, from people who have a really good idea and are building something really original and unique. And they're the
Yeah.
ones that I think we should be looking at instead of just these large multinational companies.
Love that. I have a word here I always put in yesterday. It's called Heartprint, and the word really symbolizes much of what we've talked about, which is impact, ripple effect, legacy, the possibilities that we create in other people's lives. Tim, I just love for you to take a moment just to consider what you hope that your Heartprint will be.
Oh, what a big question. I I think it all comes back to impact for me, which is the first lesson in my first book was before you do anything else, you need to think impact first. And for me, every book that I write, every knotty topic I try to spend a few years undoing and making easy for someone else to understand is because I want other people to take some of that knowledge and use it to create impact in their own lives. So for me, what I'm trying to do is kind of multiply the impact that I can have by taking something complex, making it really simple for someone to understand, and then helping them apply it to their lives, their businesses. And if that one person does that to one person and someone else does it to somebody else, that for me is where I get fulfilled. Just being able to have impact on not necessarily loads and loads and loads of people, but having a deep impact on people is really where my heartprint comes from.
I love that. I love that. I wonder what topic is, that what knotty topic is consuming your heart and your mind at the moment.
I have a bunch of topics. Some of them are moving slightly outside of even business books, and that's one thing I'm kind of discussing, having active discussion with my agent at the moment around um, whether whether my impact will can stretch and extend and influence into other bigger areas. Everything comes back to business and work. I think the work that we do is such a huge part of our life, but I can't think of any business or work topic without talking about everything that happens outside that. So Work Backwards, for example, even started as a book about work, the future of work. And then it turned into, well, we can't talk about work unless we talk about life. We
Mm.
can't talk about work unless we talk about money. So these topics kind of came into it. So the moment I'm grappling with a really big thorny issue um, that starts with work and then, like most things, ends up being bigger than that. I know that's slightly cryptic, but that's
Very cryptic, but I'll
as
take your
much
word
as
for it, and we'll speak again in 2 years' time once it's published.
yes. I'd love to come back and chat about it then as well.
Love it, Tim. Where can people connect with you? Where can they find out more about your great work?
The easiest way is to go to my website, which is timduggan.com.au. And there you'll find links to all three of my books. And you can sign up to a monthly newsletter I have called Outlet, which stands for one useful thing literally every time, which is a monthly email with one useful thing in it.
Love it, Tim. Thank you, brother. Enjoy the rest of your time here in the UK, and we'd be honoured if you'd leave us a final thought from your good self.
A final thought is when I have gone through all of this journey, I started off thinking that I wanted more and bigger and more revenue and more money and more staff. And the older I've got, and hopefully some of the wisdom that I've learned along the way, is that bigger isn't always better. And I now am really content with the size of my business, the impact that I'm having, the amount of work that I'm doing, and that's been a real journey. And I think for everyone trying to figure out what enough is for you, is something that most of us don't consciously do. And if you can figure that out, you're halfway to figuring out how to have a happy and fulfilling life.
Amen to that. Tim, thank you, brother.
Thank you.
Hey, my friends, thank you for making it to the end. I hope that our time spent together today has left you a little bit better than before you push play. I'd really appreciate if you just took a moment to leave a review to allow me to meet more people where they are and hopefully leave them a little bit better too. If you're curious to know how I, through Always Better Than Yesterday, can serve you, your team, your organisation, then head to alwaysbetterthanyesterday.com to connect. And while you're there, let me know 1 or 2 things that you're going to do as a result of listening to this conversation. I absolutely love hearing your thoughts, your reflections, and the things that this spark in your own heart and mind. If you want more insights from my heart and mind, I do send out short episodes on a Monday, Tuesday, Thursday and Friday, and again, I hope that they serve you well. I appreciate you listening. I'm Ryan Hartley, host of the Always Better Than Yesterday podcast, a podcast for heart-centered leaders just like you. Keep leading, my friends. Always love.